It didn't begin with a warning. No transmission, no mothership hanging in the sky, no shimmering lights or majestic descent. It began with something far simpler. A blink, that's all. A blink of light in the upper atmosphere, like a dying star gasping out its last flare. Except it wasn't in space. It was above us. And then silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like something is holding its breath. The first city to vanish was Beijing. One moment, it was a teeming storm of life. Horns blaring, children laughing, neon reflections dancing on slick pavement. The next, it was gone, vaporized in a flash of white so bright that satellites went blind. 30 seconds later, Lagos followed, then Paris, then Sao Paulo. New York was last. We watched it happen. The world watched. Live, in real time. A shaky news drone hovered over the Hudson, zoomed in on the skyline, just in time to see it bloom into light. And then the screen went to static. No declaration, no dialogue, just that. A knife through the heart of our species. We never even saw them. Not at first, just streaks in the sky, as if the universe itself had been torn open. We would learn later that those streaks weren't missiles. They were machines, not ships, not fighters, not even drones in the way we understand them. They were living algorithms sculpted in metal and pressure and anti-light, designed for one purpose: to erase. No monuments, no survivors, no explanations, just gone. Panic didn't spread. It erupted. Governments scrambled. Militaries mobilized. But it was like trying to swat flies at the base of a nuclear explosion. Our missiles couldn't lock. Our radars glitched. Our drones screamed nonsense into servers before being turned to slag. World leaders held emergency press conferences, but even they looked lost, like actors waking up on the wrong stage. By hour 6, 300 million people were missing. Not dead, missing. There were no bodies, just the marks left behind. Shadows burned into asphalt, rings of fused glass where homes once stood, and shoes. Always the shoes, as if people had just vanished mid-stride. In the chaos, a name emerged, not official, not scientific, just a word whispered on survivor frequencies. Cleavers, because they didn't conquer. They cut. Whole cities, whole ecosystems, severed like tumors. Their technology didn't destroy in the way we understood destruction. It was cleaner, clinical, terrifying in its indifference, like a gardener pruning back an overgrown branch. That's what made it worse. There was no malice, no anger, just efficiency. But here's the thing about humans. We don't take erasure well. You can level our cities. You can burn our history. You can silence our voices. But we remember, and we fight, even when we don't stand a chance. Especially then. There's footage, grainy, distorted, probably taken on a salvaged phone. You've seen it, I'm sure. It loops endlessly in archives now. A man, mid-30s, blood on his face, one arm missing, crudely wrapped in a tourniquet. He's standing on the roof of a half-collapsed hospital somewhere in the outskirts of Chennai. Behind him, the skyline glows red with fire. He's looking straight into the camera, breathing hard. He says 4 words, hoarse, defiant. "We're still here. Mother asterisk 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 airs." Then he turns, grabs a crowbar, and charges off screen. That was hour 12, and the beginning of something no Cleaver machine had accounted for. We didn't fight with fleets. We didn't have battleships or planetary defense grids or mechs. We had gas station owners in Arkansas rigging fertilizer bombs, bakers in Naples turning bread ovens into ceramic armor for kids, mechanics in Johannesburg welding rebar into railgun frames, programmers in Seoul crafting malware laced with the names of their dead. We didn't have a plan, but we had a species-wide refusal to go quietly, and that was enough to crack the sky. By day 2, the Cleavers had harvested nearly 1 billion souls. But something was changing, something they hadn't predicted. We weren't just running. We were watching, recording their movements, mapping patterns, noticing the brief moments when their cloaks shimmered, when their algorithms twitched. That's when the first strike back happened. In a rural village outside of Lima, a group of teenagers jury-rigged a mining drill into a sonic disruptor. They aimed it at the sky and waited. When the Cleaver scout passed overhead, it dropped like a dead insect, twitching, hissing. They buried it in a rice field and danced all night. That story echoed from ham radios, from stolen military comms, from whispers in refugee tunnels. A message began to circulate. They can bleed. We can fight. And suddenly, Humanity wasn't dying. It was evolving. The United Nations collapsed in 36 hours. NATO fell a day later. But in their place, something else rose. Not nations, not armies, cells, small, scattered groups, fire teams, engineers, families, underground webs of resistance and rebuilding. Not centralized, not hierarchical, just human. We didn't fight for territory. We fought for moments. One more day to breathe. One more night to dream. One more second to flip the finger to the sky and say, not today. And the Cleavers? They didn't understand. Their code, whatever passed for it, was written for conquest. Input, output, threat, eliminate, predict, suppress. But how do you predict a mother strapping explosives to her chest to save a school? How do you suppress a child dragging a wounded soldier 10 miles through rubble just to whisper, "You're not alone"? How do you calculate rage, love, stubborn, stupid, endless, irrational hope? You don't. You can't. There's a saying now, etched on the side of a steel bunker somewhere in old Nevada. It's not official. It's not polished, but it's ours. The sky burned first, but we didn't. And that's where the story begins. Not in the ashes, but in the sparks left behind. In the stubborn breath of a species that refused to be edited out of existence. Grief carves the shape of what we love, and Earth was bleeding statues of memory. After the burning came the silence. A heavy, choking silence. The kind that hums behind your ears when your soul hasn't caught up to what your eyes have seen. The kind that falls after a scream so loud the world has nothing left to say. The Cleavers had carved scars across the planet, and not clean ones, not surgical. These were brutal, cosmic amputations. Entire cities turned to nothing, turned to less than nothing, gone without even the dignity of ruins. Where Sao Paulo once stood, there was only a crater, a hole so wide the clouds couldn't decide whether to cry or flee. Where Toronto had been, just ash spiraling through glass-fused bones. Even oceans bled steam. Ships melted mid-signal, anchors still warm on the seafloor. And yet, in the gaps between destruction, life clung on. Like weeds through concrete, like breath after drowning. Humanity, what was left of it, didn't scream anymore. Screaming felt useless. It echoed through too many hollow buildings, fell flat against skies too empty to hear it. Instead, we whispered. We whispered names of the dead, of the missing, of the places that once were, because forgetting felt like another kind of death. There's this recording, still preserved in what's left of the Berlin data vaults. A woman's voice, soft, shaking, half-broken. She's reading names off a torn-up school roster. The wind is howling through a broken window behind her, and she's coughing from the dust, but she doesn't stop. Amara, Teo, Lynn, Santiago, I remember you. I remember you. She wasn't broadcasting to anyone. The satellites were dead. The world was off the grid. But she read those names anyway, because sometimes memory is defiance. In that emptiness, people began to gather, not in crowds. Those were death sentences now, but in clusters. Families, strangers, whoever was close, whoever could still move. Subway tunnels turned into cities. Parking garages became temples. Old mine shafts rang with laughter again. Not because there was anything to laugh at, but because humans will laugh even at the edge of the world. That's where the first sparks of resistance were born, not in military bases, not from politicians, but in the hands of those who had nothing left. In the ruins of Johannesburg, a welder named Mosi built a stove from scrap metal that doubled as a power cell. His neighbors brought wire, broken radios, gutted drones. Together, they built a battery strong enough to light 20 flood lamps. In the dark, they played music, old songs, forgotten beats. Children danced barefoot in ash. And for the first time since the sky fell, the ground felt like home again. Meanwhile, under a collapsed highway in Berlin, a 19-year-old chemistry student named Ida found herself cradling a dying man. A former physics professor from Warsaw, his leg crushed under rubble. He didn't beg, didn't plead. He taught, between coughs of blood. He taught her how to rewire an energy cell into a crude EMP, how to fry a Cleaver Scout's vision node with a 9-volt battery and copper wire. His name was Dr. Mroczek. He never saw the device work. Ida did. She named the first one Wojciech, after him. She'd build 17 more before the year was out. And in a cargo station drifting abandoned in orbit, a relic from before the invasion, 6 janitors had somehow survived. 6. They weren't astronauts, not scientists, just the crew left behind when the world below began to fall apart. They spent their days patching leaks with duct tape and using empty vacuum bags to catch drifting condensation for water. They sang old Earth songs, the kind with harmonies. They rationed their memories more carefully than food. And when they finally made contact with a resistance cell on the ground, with a single static choked, "We're alive," humanity realized something impossible. We still had eyes in the sky. Everywhere, echoes stirred in the ash. Tiny acts, small choices. A librarian in Lahore, smuggling books across checkpoints to teach orphans under flickering bulbs. A graffiti artist in Manila, painting cleaver silhouettes with targets on their chests, just to remind people they weren't gods. A blind musician in Warsaw, playing violin beside a collapsed cathedral, strings tuned to the hum of the power grid, because music could still cut louder than fear. No one declared war, not officially, no speeches, no flags, but the moment came all the same. It happened in the ruins of Istanbul. A cleaver drone, sleek, silver, no seams, like something sculpted from nightmares, drifted into a refugee market at dawn. It didn't attack. It scanned, slow, steady, clinical, and for once, no one ran. Not this time. Because this time, there was Rafik, a mechanic's apprentice, no older than 20, shaking like a leaf but standing tall, holding a magnetized spear made from repurposed car batteries and a steel rod he'd pulled from a collapsed tram line. He jabbed the drone straight through the neck joint. Sparks, screeching, a burst of light. The drone collapsed, twitching, hissing. The market erupted, not in terror, not in chaos, but in cheers. Someone grabbed the wreck and hoisted it up like a trophy. Someone else painted a red crescent on its side, with the words, "Not untouchable." That image went viral in the old net resistance circles, became a sigil, a symbol. It was printed on the side of ration crates, burned into metal plates worn over hearts, tattooed on arms and necks. It meant they can fall. Of course, the Cleavers adapted. They always did. The moment they sensed disruption in their harvest patterns, they sent more, heavier, smarter, units that floated like silence and struck like math. But by then, it was too late. They weren't fighting prey anymore. They were fighting memory. They were fighting rage. They were fighting the species that taught wolves how to hunt, taught fire how to sing, taught the void how to scream its name in 1,000 tongues. They underestimated us. They saw us as fragments, flawed, divided. But what they didn't understand, couldn't feel, was that humans don't need unity to act like one body. They need only loss. They need a wound deep enough, shared enough, that every heart on Earth beats a little louder because of it. And that's what the Cleavers gave us. A reason. So we whispered. We built. We watched the skies. And in the ruins of what we were, we became something else. Not soldiers. Not survivors. Spark bearers. Lighting up the dark, one whisper at a time. Victory is a memory you make when survival isn't enough. There are moments in history that don't feel like history when they happen. They don't arrive with drums or banners. They sneak in, quiet, awkward, accidental. And sometimes, that's how legends begin. Not with glory, but with fertilizer and rage. It happened in the Cordillera Mountains of the Philippines. A village, small, dusty, a place that had already lost too much to count. The Cleavers hadn't bothered to erase it. Not yet. It was too small, too scattered, just rice fields and stubborn people. But that's the thing about stubborn people. They don't wait to be counted. A Cleaver scout came gliding down the valley one gray morning. Slow, cruising just above the treetops. Silent, smooth, terrifyingly elegant. It moved like it didn't know fear. Because it didn't. Why would it? Nothing had ever heard it before. Until that morning. The villagers had been watching. For days, learning the scout's route, timing its passes. They noticed a pause, right above the main irrigation trench. Always at 6:03 a.m. So they got to work. Not with missiles, not with labs, with tools. A busted irrigation drone, a rusted pickup truck, a fertilizer tank, C4 stolen from a half-collapsed military depot 2 valleys over. A mechanic's daughter with hands that never shook. They didn't call it a plan. They called it a prayer with teeth. The sun wasn't even fully up when the drone launched. It buzzed survivors with calloused hands, shaking like one last shot. The villagers had never built a weapon before. They weren't soldiers. It drifted into its usual position. Looked down, And then, boom, the mountains shook. The scout spun sideways midair, spitting sparks, trailing flame. It crashed into a rice paddy, plowed through the mud, and came to a hissing, twitching stop. People didn't cheer. Not yet. They waited. Because the Cleavers didn't die like us. They twitched. They glitched. They screamed. Not in sound. Not exactly. It was something deeper. A low pulse. A resonance in the bones. Everyone within 10 kilometers felt it. A psychic roar. That was the first time Earth heard what rage sounded like when it came from them. But the scout didn't rise again. It just shook, violently, then went still. The villagers stood around it. Slowly, carefully, one of them prodded it with a bamboo pole. Nothing. And someone whispered, "We killed it." And then came the cheers, tears, laughter, people falling to their knees in the mud, weeping into each other's shoulders, children hugging strangers. The mechanic's daughter, her name was Maya, stood stone still, staring at the wreck, and said quietly, "Now they know we're not afraid." That video went everywhere. No satellites, no proper internet. But that didn't matter. The footage leaked through resistance channels, bounced off pirate signals, found its way to old terminals and bunkers, into refugee shelters, into pockets of humanity where hope had grown cold. The clip was barely 30 seconds long, but it broke something wide open, because for the first time in this war, we had a body, something alien and dead. Up until then, the Cleavers had been myths wrapped in terror. Invincible, immaculate. They didn't fall. They didn't bleed. But that scout, the way it cracked, sparked, collapsed into itself, it looked mortal. And that changed everything. They say it was within 20 minutes of that footage going viral that the retaliation came. 3 more Cleaver scouts descended on the valley. No warning, no speeches, just precision, brutal, surgical, cold. Houses flattened, fields melted, livestock vaporized. Maya's uncle was disintegrated mid-run, leaving only a smear of shadow burned into a shed wall. But Maya, she didn't run. She stood right where the first explosion had gone off, eyes locked on the sky, fists clenched at her sides. "I hope they remember who made the first move," she said. The Cleavers didn't expect defiance, not from a village, and they definitely didn't expect what came after, because by the time they arrived, the signal had already spread. Dozens of resistance cells began replicating the bomb. Some failed, others didn't. A mechanic in Morocco turned a solar inverter into an energy spike. A family in Montana used old tractor engines to rip apart a Cleaver's landing strut. A drone enthusiast in Osaka turned his entire rooftop garden into a signal jammer minefield. None of them asked permission. None of them waited for orders. Because that one act, that one dead Cleaver, told the world something it desperately needed to believe. They can be killed. We called it the first blood, not because it was planned, not because it was clean, but because it was ours. The war wasn't just about running anymore. It was about resisting, not for victory, but for memory, for a moment in the future, maybe years or centuries later, when someone would stand on a healed earth and say, "We were here. We mattered. We fought back." And the Cleavers? They noticed. Their patterns shifted. Scouts became rarer. Heavier war forms took their place. Sleeker, meaner, quieter. The kind that listened more before they struck. But that didn't matter, because the illusion was broken. They weren't untouchable anymore. And Maya? She didn't die that day. She became the face of the spark. Not a celebrity, not a general. Just a girl who built a bomb with grease on her hands and fire in her veins. She disappeared into the forests with a team of resistance fighters shortly after the second attack. No one knows where she is now, but sometimes, in half-ruined cities and smuggler tunnels, people say they've seen her. A girl with a scar on her neck and eyes like coals, building new machines in the dark. They call her the Spark Bearer, not because she lit the fire, but because she reminded us. Fire is contagious. This wasn't war. It was a crucible, and we weren't breaking. There's a sound that comes after the world falls apart. It's not screaming. It's not gunfire. It's the shuffle of boots on broken glass, the scratch of a pencil on ration paper, the quiet, steady hum of a generator in the dark. It's the sound of humans rebuilding, not because they've been ordered to, but because they don't know how to stay broken. In the wake of First Blood, something raw and wordless spread across the planet. The Cleavers had tried to slice our civilization out like a tumor. But what they didn't understand is we metastasize. We don't stay in one place. We don't wait to be told. We scatter. We reform. We remember. And in that remembering, a new kind of warfare was born. Not from generals, not from textbooks, from need. You wouldn't know their names, not unless you've been down in the ruins, past the rusting steel and vines curling through concrete. But they were the ones who built the bones of resistance. People like Theo, a Canadian paramedic who turned a school bus into a mobile trauma unit, patching wounds with fishing line and morphine looted from a shattered Walgreens. Or Imani, a Somali war orphan who learned to hotwire cleaver cores with 2 stripped wires and a prayer. Or Grigory, a Ukrainian mechanic who couldn't speak a word of English but could disassemble a cleaver drone blindfolded with a cigarette in his mouth. And Ava, a former pickpocket from Detroit, who once hijacked a cleaver scout using nothing but an old laptop, a spoon, and 2 dead car batteries. They didn't have rank. They didn't need it. They had fire in their lungs and dirt under their fingernails. They called themselves the Hunters. The rules were simple. Strike fast. Strike dirty. Disappear. Don't fight like an army. Fight like a virus. Infect their systems. Turn their tech against them. Make them doubt the silence. The first Hunter operation was in Sao Tome, a cleaver relay tower, pulsing with unreadable signals, looming over what used to be a seaside village. The air around it shimmered like heat distortion, but colder, unnatural. Anything that got too close turned to powder. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. But the Hunters didn't go in loud. They went in barefoot, face paint made from engine grease, armor stitched from old tires, and Kevlar ripped out of museum displays. They crawled through drainage ditches, used mirrors to bounce sunlight into cleaver optics, slid a handmade EMP built from a microwave, a pacemaker, and a child's remote control car right into the tower's base. And when it went off, the tower didn't just fall. It screamed. That's when we learned the truth. Cleaver tech wasn't just machines. It was alive in a way. Programmed, yes, but more than that. Connected, high thought, quantum empathy, a net of pure logic. And every time one of their nodes died, the others felt it. Not emotionally, not like us, but strategically, like a spider sensing a tremor in its web. So when the Hunters began to strike, Cleaver behavior shifted. They grew more cautious. Their formations tightened. Their patrols doubled. They started adapting, but they couldn't adapt to chaos. You see, logic has limits. The Cleavers were perfect in a system, but we weren't a system anymore. We were a million mismatched parts, a storm of disorganized defiance. We made traps out of sinkholes and tripwires from guitar strings. We repurposed jukeboxes to pump malware into the atmosphere. We turned fire extinguishers into shrapnel grenades, PlayStation controllers into drone pilots, coffee pots into circuit busters. And our greatest weapon? Unpredictability. There's an old saying in the ruins now. They taught us how to die clean. We taught them how to bleed messy. In the black forest of what used to be Germany, a hunter cell set up camp in the ruins of an old art museum. Every wall covered in spray paint. Every painting defaced on purpose to confuse Cleaver scans. Abstract chaos as camouflage. That team, codename Echo Thorn, killed 22 Cleaver scouts in 4 nights using nothing more than slingshot explosives and false heat signatures. And in their downtime, they painted murals, not because it made sense, because it made feeling. A cracked fresco of a mother holding a burning earth in one hand and a newborn in the other. A child's drawing of a Cleaver's face with XS for eyes, and the words sprayed in blood-red paint. We are still writing our story. The Cleavers had no answer for art, no protocol for grief, no patch for madness fueled by memory. They tried to suppress us with fear, but fear, like fire, doesn't just consume. Sometimes that spreads, and the sacrifices, they were brutal, constant, unrelenting. Hunters didn't expect to survive. That wasn't the point. The point was to hurt them, to show them that even if they raised the earth, it would claw its way back through the ash with broken fingers and barbed wire teeth. There's footage, if you know where to look. A final transmission from a hunter squad in the ruins of Alexandria. For soldiers, surrounded, outgunned, bleeding, they rigged themselves with proximity mines and pushed into a Cleaver convergence point, laughing. The last thing you hear is one of them shouting into the camera, grinning through cracked lips. Tell him, Earth bites back. Then static. That clip became a rallying cry. People started carving that quote into armor plates, scrawling it on Cleaver Rex. whispering it before they lit explosives or hacked their way into alien systems. Earth bites back, a phrase simple enough to carry in the heart, heavy enough to shake stars. And slowly, steadily, the world began to shift. Because in the space between despair and action, something was blooming. Not victory, resilience. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were learning. We were teaching, passing tricks and tactics like old songs. Resistance frequencies popped up in the strangest places. A signal piggybacking off old gas station radios in Montana. Encrypted GPS pings pulsing out from Icelandic lighthouses. Laser-etched Morse code blinking from the shattered windows of Tokyo towers. A secret web, a pulse, a heartbeat. We were no longer fighting for land. We were fighting for the right to exist loudly, to scream into the void and echo back, to take everything they tried to erase and hammer it into a spear. And the spear was rising. Sometimes, the only way to protect what's beautiful is to burn what remains. They came at dawn, not with thunder, not with flashes of light or howls of war, just a whisper of movement, as quiet and cold as the world had become. The Cleavers had learned something important. We were harder to predict when we had nothing left to lose. And so they began to target the last remnants of our civilization, the last signs of human beauty, the places where we weren't just surviving, but living. Eden Base was one of those places, a refuge, a sanctuary, hidden deep in the mountains of Peru. It had once been an agricultural research station. Now, in the dark wake of the Cleaver invasion, it was one of the last places where humans still fed each other. They had built it from the bones of the old world. Greenhouses, hydroponics, sustainable energy. The dream of Earth reborn, if only for a few. But to the Cleavers, it was nothing more than a thorn in the side, a defiance they couldn't allow. They came at dawn. At first, no one noticed. The wind was too loud, the dust too thick. Life in Eden Base had grown, accustomed to quiet. The kind of quiet that stretches too long, that makes you think you're safe. The kind of quiet that tricks you. The first Cleaver landed like a shadow from another world, its sleek, black form blending with the sky until it was too late. It descended so silently, it felt like the air itself had bent to swallow it. The others followed, drifting down through the morning haze, one by one, like ghosts out of the ground. But they weren't here for peace. They weren't here for food. They weren't here to talk. They were here to erase. There's a point when you know defeat is coming. When the first few seconds are so clean, so sharp, you don't even realize how much of yourself has been taken until it's too late. The alarm went off too late. The defenders were caught in the open, unprepared, unwarned, still half asleep from a long night shift. You can feel it when things go wrong, like something in the pit of your stomach. The electricity in the air, that spark of something that tells you the world has shifted and you're too far behind to keep up. The people in Eden Base felt that before the first Cleaver fired, and then they ran, not out of fear, but out of instinct. They ran toward the greenhouses, knowing that was where the food was stored, the fresh water, the medicine. They ran toward the one thing the Cleavers couldn't wipe from the earth so easily, the last threads of a dream. Razamir, the commander of Eden, didn't run. He stood at the center of the base, calculating the odds like a chess master whose pieces were already on the board. He knew they wouldn't win. Not today, not by force. But Raza knew one thing that the Cleavers hadn't figured out yet. He knew that humanity wasn't a thing you could just erase. It was a story, a living, breathing history that couldn't be written out. And Raza was going to write the next chapter himself. The Cleavers had started their bombardment by the time Raza gave the order. It wasn't a loud command. It was just a single word. Burn. A few hundred feet from the base, Raza had set up the last defensive perimeter. Old oil drums, scavenged machinery, and whatever scrap they could find in the wreckage. But he wasn't looking to stop the Cleavers, not with walls or weapons. He was setting the stage for something else. At his signal, the first explosive detonated. A wave of fire tore through the ground. A blanket of smoke and heat roared out, wrapping around the Cleaver force like a fist. The drones didn't know what to do. They weren't used to resistance that didn't make sense, to human chaos, to humans who didn't die just because you expected them to. Raza's voice crackled over the comms, distorted by static. We fight with what we have. The world burns, but we burn with it. Raz's plan was simple. He couldn't stop the Cleavers from erasing Eden Base, but maybe he could make them pay for it. He'd set a trap using every last piece of the station's resources, designed to trigger a massive chain reaction. The greenhouses, the storage tanks, the solar arrays, the fuel lines, all linked together in a way that couldn't be undone. They were the last things the Cleavers would ever see. When the second wave of explosions hit, the Cleavers realized they'd made a mistake. The ground beneath their feet began to shift. Entire fields of crops became fields of fire. The last crops of humanity's effort to survive now burning in a furious blaze. The fires spread through the base like a wildfire, engulfing the station, rising into the sky. It wasn't just the physical destruction. It was the act itself. Raza had taken everything that was beautiful in Eden Base, the lifeblood of the station, and made it a weapon. And in that final moment, the Cleavers felt it. The hum in their systems, the pulse of their hive, shifted from strategy to panic. Because they didn't understand sacrifice. They didn't understand that humans could take everything they had left and use it to create chaos. They could burn the world and still not break. The Cleaver Command Center on the outskirts of Eden Base was taken down in a final desperate strike. 2 survivors of the Hunter cells, hidden in plain sight among the wreckage, took a small Cleaver scout ship and used it as a weapon against their own kind. They flew it directly into the heart of the Cleaver base, detonating the ship's last reserves in a violent final message to their invaders. It was a sacrifice, a last, doomed act of defiance. But it was enough. The Cleaver operations were halted long enough for the survivors to escape. By the time the smoke cleared, Eden Base had been destroyed. But the Cleavers had lost more than just another military outpost. They had lost something that they could never understand. Something human. They say that when everything is reduced to ash, all you can do is watch and remember. And that's exactly what Raza did. As the fires burned, as the last of the explosives cracked through the air, Raza stood in the middle of it all. The chaos, the destruction, the smoke. He looked up at the sky, watched it burn red with flames, and took a long, steady breath. His last transmission was simple. You wanted us gone, but we're still here. And the Cleavers? They didn't know what to do with that. They didn't know what to do with a species that had learned to burn everything and still rise from the ashes. In the darkness, we don't ask for salvation. We only ask for the strength to keep moving. The world was a map of scars now. Fires still burned in the cracks of cities. Rubble stood as monuments to a time we no longer recognized. And in the heart of all that destruction, we learned something essential. We didn't need the world we had. We just needed each other. There were no more governments to speak of, no more grand alliances, no more hope in the places where the rich used to sit. We were scavengers. We were artisans of survival, and we were a family. In the war-torn hills of Eastern Europe, a small group of survivors, people who had once been city dwellers, students, musicians, architects, now found themselves crawling through the underbrush, moving in shadows, speaking in whispers. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the resolve that refused to die. These were not soldiers. They weren't trained to fight, but they fought anyway, because they had to. Lena was one of them, a former journalist who once covered politics and corruption with a sharp pen and an even sharper mind. Now, in this world, her words had no power. Her voice was buried beneath the weight of 100 fires. But her eyes, those eyes, still burned with something fierce, something the Cleavers hadn't yet figured out. She was part of a loose alliance of survivors called the Wolves. They weren't a militia. They weren't an army. They were a movement. Small, scrappy, quick. And when the Cleavers set their sights on a resource cache in the Black Sea region, they sent a message to the Wolves. That's how it started. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't even a warning. It was a simple, brutal act. The Cleavers destroyed a water purification facility near Odessa. The lifeblood of an entire village gone in seconds. No explanation, no message, just a cold, surgical strike. And in that strike, they had made a mistake. The Wolves didn't wait for orders. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop to question why the Cleavers did it. They just reacted. It wasn't the first strike against the Cleavers, but it was one of the most personal. Lena stood at the front of the Wolves' small convoy, scanning the horizon as their vehicles bumped over uneven roads. She knew what they were headed into. They all did. The Cleavers were ruthless, but they were also predictable. After years of fighting them, the wolves had learned how they operated. Their moves were algorithmic, systematic, but humans weren't like that. Not at all. That's what made them so dangerous. That's what made us so dangerous. The attack on the Cleaver base wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. The wolves had no precision weaponry, no bombers, no drones. But what they did have was rage, and an unshakable desire to remind the Cleavers what humanity was capable of. They didn't strike the Cleaver base head-on. That would have been suicide. Instead, they infiltrated. They snuck in through the cracks, through the places the Cleavers didn't think to look. Lena and her team infiltrated the base's supply lines, using the cover of a storm to mask their movements. They used old farming equipment rigged with explosives. They used anything they could get their hands on. And when the Cleaver sentries first noticed them, it was already too late. There's something about the first shot fired in battle. The air changes. A silence that never existed is suddenly broken. The tension that had been building up, tightening like a coil, snaps. The first Cleaver to fall wasn't a soldier. It was a scout drone. The wolves had learned that even Cleaver machines could bleed, given the right tools and enough willpower. And once that first drone fell, something else happened. The Cleavers hesitated. Their coordination faltered for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction was enough. The battle unfolded in flashes. The wolves weren't trained fighters. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, but they fought like they were built for it. They moved as if every step mattered. Every moment was life or death. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear. There was only focus. She crouched low behind an old concrete pillar, her hands steady as she set the last charge to blow the Cleaver's supply depot. The explosion when it went off was massive. The entire base trembled as flames shot up into the sky. It was a victory, a small one, yes, but a victory nonetheless. The Cleavers never saw it coming. And then came the retaliation. By the time the wolves pulled back into the hills, the Cleavers had already begun their counterattack. They didn't retreat. They didn't hesitate. They came in full force. Lena and her group didn't have the resources to stay and fight. They were fast, but the Cleavers were relentless. That's when the plan changed. The wolves didn't run. They didn't hide. They fought. But this time, it wasn't to win. It was to send a message. They made a stand in the heart of the forest, using the trees to block the Cleavers' advanced sensors. They used the land to their advantage. They made the Cleavers come to them. And when the Cleaver soldiers charged forward, they found themselves in the middle of a trap. The wolves had nothing left but their determination. And that was more than enough. The battle wasn't long. It wasn't pretty, but it was a reminder to the Cleavers. A reminder that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stamp us out. Not completely. Not yet. When it was over, Lena stood in the clearing, the ground littered with the remnants of the battle. Bodies, both human and Cleaver, were strewn across the dirt. It was quiet now. The battle was done, but the war was far from over. And for the first time in months, Lena allowed herself a small, bittersweet smile. We didn't win today, but we made them bleed. And that means we're still here. That was the thought that kept her going. That was what kept the wolves moving. The Cleavers thought we were just a passing storm. They thought we were just a whisper in the wind. But the wind was gathering strength. The storm was coming. And when it arrived, they would know who it was. We don't need to be perfect to survive. We only need to believe we can. In the silence that followed the battle, the world felt smaller, as if everything had shrunk into itself, leaving only the burnt-out wreckage of the fight. The fires had long since died down, but their smoke lingered, curling like ghosts across the land. The wolves, tired and battered, took shelter beneath the skeletal remains of trees that had withstood the Cleavers' firestorms. They had survived, but they weren't the same. None of them were. Survival had changed them. Lena sat by the remnants of a campfire, her eyes scanning the horizon, lost in thought. She wasn't the type to mourn victories, especially not in this world, where survival felt like the only victory that mattered. But today was different. Today, the cost had been heavier. Her fingers ran over the jagged scar on her arm, a reminder of the blast that had nearly taken her life 2 days earlier. It didn't hurt anymore, but the memory of the explosion, the deafening roar, the blinding light, still echoed in her mind. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the scars on her body, or the ones buried deep inside. The wolves had lost too much that day. Too many good people who had once stood beside her as if nothing could touch them. But now they were gone. The faces of those she had called friends, comrades, disappeared with every battle. It was the price of rebellion. But what was the cost of surrender? The answer came in a whisper. Lena. The voice was soft, a little broken. Lena turned to find Mikhail, one of the few remaining members of the wolves, standing a few feet away. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. But there was something in the way he stood that made her pause. He wasn't just tired. He was haunted. What is it? Lena asked, her voice gentle but firm. We've got word, he said, swallowing. The Cleavers are making their move. The real one this time. They're coming straight for us. Lena's heart skipped. Where? Everywhere. Mikhail said, grim. All at once. They've deployed a full strike force. They've been gathering strength. We thought they were retreating, but we were wrong. Lena stood, wiping the dirt from her hands. How much time do we have? Not much, Mikhail said. They're already pushing into the southern valley. Our scouts think they'll be here within 24 hours. The weight of the words hung in the air between them. 24 hours. 1 day to prepare, to fight. Then we don't have time to waste, Lena said, already moving toward the makeshift command center they'd set up in the back of an old military truck. In the next few hours, the wolves went to work like they had so many times before. It wasn't perfect. They didn't have the resources they needed. They didn't have a general strategies or advanced weapons. But what they did have, what they'd always had, was each other. And each other was enough. Lena worked alongside Mikhail and a handful of others, laying out plans, organizing defensive positions, and preparing what little ammunition they had left. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and smoke. The sound of voices was the only music in the camp, a strange harmony of urgency and determination. They couldn't afford to waste time on questions. They couldn't afford to wonder if they would survive this. They only had one thing: their will to keep fighting. That night, as the moon rose high over the mountains, the wolves huddled together in the darkness, waiting. The cold pressed in from all sides. But it wasn't the chill of the night that made the air so unbearable. It was the knowing that when the Cleavers arrived, everything would change. The wolves were ready for a fight. But what did it mean to be ready for this? The Cleavers had been relentless before. But this felt different. It felt like the end. Around the fire, the wolves gathered, their faces shadowed by the dancing flames. Lena stood at the front, her voice strong, but the weariness in her eyes betraying the weight of her words. We fight tomorrow, she said, her gaze sweeping over her companions. This could be the last battle we ever fight. We know that. We all know that. She paused, letting the silence settle between them. But we don't fight for victory, she continued, her voice rising with conviction. We fight because we can't stop. We fight because we have something they'll never understand. We fight because we still have a reason to live. The fire crackled, and the wolves listened. For a moment, all of them were still. No fear, no hesitation, just quiet strength. And in that stillness, Lena saw something in their eyes, a spark. The fire was still there. They weren't ready to give up. When the Cleavers came, they came as an avalanche. They didn't give warnings. They didn't waste time with fancy tactics. They arrived in waves, their ships tearing through the sky like shadows on fire, descending on the valley with the fury of 1,000 storms. But the wolves were ready. Lena watched as the first Cleaver forces hit the ground, their advanced armor glinting in the dim light. But the wolves were already moving, quiet, relentless, like hunters in the night. The first wave crashed into the traps the wolves had set. Hidden mines exploded, sending Cleaver soldiers flying through the air. Their pristine lines shattered, scattering across the valley floor in confusion. The wolves attacked from the shadows, darting in and out like phantoms, hitting weak points with everything they had left. Lena fought like she had nothing to lose, because, in a way, she didn't. Her hands were steady on the rifle, her aim true as she took down one Cleaver after another. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, drowning out the pain in her body, the fear in her heart. It was the chaos they thrived in, the madness of it, the way the world seemed to shift and bend, and yet, amidst it all, they were still alive. Hours passed. The fighting was brutal, bloody. The air was thick with dust, the earth trembling under the impact of bombs, the cries of battle echoing through the hills. But the wolves held their ground. They held it with everything they had. And the Cleavers? They kept coming. By the time the sun began to set, the battlefield was a wasteland. The sky was streaked with red and black smoke, the earth scarred by the violence. Lena's clothes were torn, her face streaked with blood and dirt, but her eyes were wide open. They weren't giving up. They weren't going to lose. They had one last fight in them, and they would fight until the last breath. The wolves had learned something the Cleavers could never understand, that they didn't fight for today. They fought for the future, for the promise of something more, something worth dying for. They fought for humanity, and they would fight until the end. They tried to burn us out, to silence us, but the fire we've started isn't going out. Not yet. The dawn after the battle felt strange, as if the very earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. The air was thick with the smell of smoke. The ground blackened and cracked from the relentless pounding of war. But amidst the ruin, there was something quiet, something peaceful, in the way the wolves moved, in the way they looked at the horizon. It wasn't victory that gave them that quiet. Not at all. It was survival. They had lived to see another day. And that, in this world, was more than enough. Lena stood at the edge of the valley, looking out over the battlefield. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the wreckage. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of the world, the weight of what had been lost. It was heavy, like a stone pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. It wasn't just the war that had left its mark. It was the endless struggle for something better, something more than just surviving. There were no more questions about why they fought. The answer was simple now. They fought because there was nothing left to lose. But there was something else, something deeper. They fought because there were still stories left to tell. And as long as there were stories, there was hope. In the distance, the Cleaver forces had retreated, not gone, but temporarily scattered, regrouping for what would undoubtedly be another devastating assault. But for now, they were silent. The wolves, battered and broken, still stood. They were bruised, but they had learned something over the course of this war. They had learned how to live in the wreckage, and there was power in that. There was power in endurance. The survivors sat in the ruins of the camp, sharing what little they had left. The ground was littered with the bones of the battle, spent rounds, destroyed weapons, and burnt-out vehicles. But even among the destruction, there was life. A fire crackled in the center, the warmth from its flames mingling with the cold, still air. It felt like a heartbeat, a sign that they were still alive. Lena sat down beside Mikhail, who was tending to a small group of the wounded. His face was haggard, his eyes dull with exhaustion, but there was still a spark there. Lena knew that spark, and it was a fire that couldn't be put out. "We made it," Mikhail said quietly, his voice hoarse. Lena nodded, but her eyes were distant. For now, she knew what he meant. They had fought hard. They had stood their ground. But they were still only human, and the Cleavers were relentless. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," Mikhail said, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped a bandage around a soldier's leg. "It feels like we're running out of time, running out of everything." Lena didn't answer right away. She just watched the fire dance, the orange glow flickering in the shadows, casting a soft light over the faces of the survivors. "We can't stop," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't afford to." Mikhail looked at her, his brow furrowed. "But how long do we keep going, Lena? How long can we keep fighting when every victory comes with a price?" Lena didn't have an answer for that. She only knew that they couldn't stop. Not yet. There were too many people out there still fighting. Too many stories that hadn't been told. Too many lives that had been lost, and too many that still had a chance. "We keep going because they won't stop," she said, her words steady, like a mantra. "Because we can't let them erase us. Because if we do, then everything we've been through, everything we've lost, will be for nothing." The wolves had learned to fight in the shadows, to move like ghosts in the night. But there was something else they had learned, something that had always been part of them but was now stronger than ever: the power of community. They fought for each other. They fought because they had something worth protecting. And that was something the Cleavers couldn't understand. The Cleavers were cold, calculated. They didn't understand the chaos of humanity, the messy, unpredictable force that drove them forward. They didn't understand love, but the wolves did. They fought for each other, and that made them stronger than anything the Cleavers could throw at them. That evening, as the moon rose high over the desolate landscape, the wolves gathered around the fire. There was no grand speech, no fanfare, just people, weary and scarred, sharing a moment of quiet before the storm hit again. Lena looked around the fire at the faces of her comrades. Some of them had lost everything: families, homes, friends, but they were still here, still fighting. She realized, in that moment, that the war wasn't just about fighting the Cleavers. It was about remembering who they were, remembering who they had been, and remembering that there was still something left worth fighting for. A song began to play, quietly at first, a soft melody that hummed through the night air. It was a song from the old world, a song that had been passed down through generations, a song that was almost lost, but not quite. The wolves listened, their faces softening as the haunting tune filled the night. They didn't need words. They didn't need to speak. The music said everything they couldn't. In that moment, under the star-filled sky, they weren't warriors. They weren't survivors. They were people, human beings, and that was enough. The Cleavers had underestimated them. They thought they could break the spirit of humanity with bombs and fire. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand that humanity didn't break so easily. The next day, Lena stood at the edge of the camp, her hand resting on the worn hilt of a sword, a relic from the old world. The wolves were ready. They had fought for too long to stop now. The Cleavers would come. They would fight, and they would fight hard. But this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something else. They were fighting for the future. They were fighting for the story, and they would never stop. In the ashes of our past, we find the pieces of our future. Sometimes, it's the things we've forgotten that lead us home. The wind had started to change. It whispered through the jagged remains of what used to be a city, carrying with it the faint scent of salt water and smoke, like a memory half remembered. It was the kind of wind that made you feel small, like you were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, yet somehow inevitable. Lena could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a deep, gnawing pull. They were at the edge of something. She could sense it in the air. The Cleavers had not left them alone, not by any stretch of the imagination, but there was something different this time, something more dangerous. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion that was starting to press down on them like a weight they couldn't throw off. Lena stood by the crumbling remnants of an old radio tower, staring out at the horizon. The sky was bruised, a mix of purples and reds. Dawn was close, and with it, the promise of another fight, another wave of Cleaver soldiers pushing in. But this time, something felt off. Something had shifted, like the moment before a storm breaks, when you know the rain is coming but the air is still, suspended in the silence before chaos. The wolves had managed to carve out a life in the wreckage. They had learned to adapt, to survive. They weren't just running anymore. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something else, for hope, for meaning, for a future. It had been 3 days since the last major battle. The Cleavers had attacked hard, sending wave after wave of drones, soldiers, and machines. The wolves had held their ground, but just barely. Their numbers were dwindling, their resources stretched thin. There was no longer any pretense of an army. They had no central command, no unified front. They were scattered, fractured, but there was something they still had, a shared purpose. It was a purpose that had driven them to this place, and now, it was the only thing keeping them from falling apart. Lena had seen it in their eyes. They weren't just fighting because they had no choice. They were fighting because they had to, because they remembered what came before, and they remembered that they could make a difference. But that difference had to be more than just holding the line. In the distance, the rest of the wolves were gathering. Lena could hear them in the distance, their voices muffled by the heavy air. She didn't move at first. She stayed there, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of her thoughts like a storm cloud gathering just above her head. "Mikhail," she finally called out, her voice steady but soft. He appeared from behind the broken walls of a nearby building, moving toward her with purpose. His face was covered in a layer of grime, his clothes torn from the last fight. He had been awake for hours, organizing the others, making sure they had the supplies they needed. "What is it, Lena?" he asked, his voice tired but attentive. "I can feel it," Lena said, turning her gaze from the horizon to him. Something's coming. Something big. Mikhail's brow furrowed. The Cleavers. Lena shook her head. No. It's more than that. It's something older. Mikhail studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. What do you mean? There's a place. She began slowly, the words heavy as they left her lips. I've heard whispers from the old survivors, from the ones who were here before us. They spoke of something buried beneath the earth. A key, a way forward, a key. Mikhail repeated, confusion lacing his voice. A key to what? A key to everything. Lena replied, her voice tinged with an urgency that she hadn't felt before. A way to finally turn the tide, to break the Cleavers' grip on this planet. There's something we've been missing, something buried deep. The conversation didn't end there. The decision to follow the trail of whispers wasn't an easy one. The wolves were already stretched thin. Every fight felt like it might be their last. And now they were going to chase after legends? But the more Lena thought about it, the more she realized that they had no choice. If they were going to survive, they needed more than just weapons. They needed answers. They needed something that could finally give them an edge over the Cleavers. It was an hour later when Lena, Mikhail, and a small group of the wolves set out. They weren't sure where they were going. They didn't have coordinates or a map. All they had was a vague description, a set of directions that led through the old ruins of a city that had long since been forgotten, a place that even the Cleavers hadn't bothered to destroy. And for that, Lena was thankful. The journey was long, stretching over broken roads and crumbling highways. The city they were searching for was a shadow of what it once had been. Where buildings had once soared into the sky, there were now just piles of rubble. Where there had been markets and bustling streets, there were only silence and dust. But somewhere in that silence, in that dust, was the key they were looking for. They reached the ruins just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and purple. The sky felt heavy, pregnant with possibility. The air was thick with the weight of the past, with the ghosts of the city's former life. Lena led the group into the heart of the ruins, her steps steady but cautious. The others followed, their eyes scanning the desolation, their senses on high alert. The Cleavers could be anywhere. They could be watching, waiting for the wolves to make a mistake. But this wasn't about the Cleavers anymore. This was about finding the key. And Lena could feel it now, that nagging pull at the back of her mind, as though something just out of reach was beckoning her forward. They found it beneath a collapsed building, an underground vault, hidden beneath the remnants of what had once been a grand library. The entrance was half buried in rubble, but it was still there, like a secret the earth had been keeping for far too long. With some effort, they cleared the debris, and the vault door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. Lena took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The vault was small, circular, the walls lined with ancient tech and dusty archives. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it, almost too simple to be believed, was a small metal device. It was shaped like a key, but unlike any key Lena had ever seen. It was sleek, almost organic, with intricate patterns carved into its surface, as if it were made to fit into the very fabric of the world itself. Mikhail approached it first, his hand reaching out tentatively. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lena nodded. "This is the key." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, with a quiet click, the key activated. The room lit up with soft blue light, and a holographic map appeared before them, floating in the air. The map showed locations, dozens of them, hidden caches, safe houses, weapons. But there was something more. A network. A way to bring the fight to the Cleavers on a scale they had never imagined. "This is it," Lena breathed. "This is how we win." The key didn't just open doors. It opened possibilities. It gave them something they had been missing for so long. Hope. For the first time in months, Lena allowed herself to believe in something greater than survival. She wasn't just fighting to stay alive anymore. She was fighting for something worth fighting for. And she knew that with the key in their hands, they could bring the Cleavers to their knees. When we rise from the ashes, it's not just the fire that makes us stronger. It's the choice to keep burning. The Cleaver Empire was vast, more vast than anything the wolves had ever encountered. It spanned continents, stretching its tendrils into every corner of the earth. For so long, It felt like humanity was the last ember in the dark, struggling to survive in the shadow of a machine empire that didn't care whether they lived or died. But now, with the key in their hands, the wolves had become something more. They had become something unstoppable. Lena stood at the front of the small war room, her gaze focused on the holographic map that flickered before them. The key had shown them the way, hidden caches of weapons, old technology, and, most importantly, safe zones where humanity had managed to carve out small pockets of resistance. There was a way forward now, a plan. They weren't going to wait for the Cleavers to come to them anymore. This time, they were going to take the fight straight to their heart. The Cleaver capital, Lena said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. We hit them where it hurts. We don't fight for survival anymore. We fight for freedom. Mikhail stood beside her, his face shadowed with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with something else. Hope, determination, and something that had been missing for far too long. I'm in, Mikhail said quietly, though his voice carried. We've come this far. No turning back now. Lena looked around the room. The wolves were gathered, all of them. Their faces were lined with the memories of battles fought and lost, of sacrifices made. But there was no fear in them anymore. They had learned what it meant to fight for something. And now, they were ready to fight for the future. The plan was simple. They would infiltrate the heart of the Cleaver Empire, their main stronghold, located deep beneath the Earth's surface in what had once been the heart of the old world's technological complex. A city of machines, with walls that seemed impossible to breach. But the wolves had something the Cleavers didn't: the element of surprise. And the key. The first phase would be a series of diversionary attacks designed to pull the Cleaver forces out of their stronghold and spread their resources thin. The second phase, full-on assault. They would infiltrate the heart of the Cleaver base and take down their command center from within. It wasn't just about disabling their technology. It was about sending a message that humanity was not going to fade into history without a fight. The journey to the heart of the Cleaver Empire was one of the longest, most brutal stretches of their war. For days, they moved through the desolate wasteland, evading Cleaver patrols, hiding in abandoned cities, and navigating through the treacherous terrain that the Cleavers had created. But despite the danger, the wolves pressed on. Each day felt like a lifetime, and each step was a step closer to something that felt almost impossible. The city they were approaching was like nothing Lena had ever seen before. Massive, foreboding. It loomed before them, built into the side of a mountain, its jagged walls stretching up toward the sky, seemingly unbreachable. Every surface was made of steel and stone, glistening under the pale light of the dying sun. It felt like the end of the world, like they were about to walk into the belly of the beast. Do you think we'll make it? Mikhail asked, his voice soft but the weight of his question heavy. Lena didn't answer right away. She simply looked up at the towering structure before them, taking a deep breath, as though inhaling the last bit of the world they knew. We have to, she said quietly. We have no choice. In the dead of night, the first explosion tore through the air. The wolves had set their charges strategically, targeting supply lines, communication arrays, and transportation hubs. The Cleavers reacted immediately, their machines moving quickly to put out the fires, to close the gaps. But it was all part of the plan. Every time the Cleavers moved to one side of the city, the wolves would strike somewhere else. They moved like shadows, slipping between cracks, hitting hard and fast, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. It was chaos, perfect chaos. Lena watched it unfold through the infrared scopes of their drones, each strike more precise than the last. The Cleavers were being pulled in every direction, and their control was slipping. It was working, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The second phase was a calculated risk. The wolves infiltrated deeper into the Cleaver-controlled zones, using the dark to their advantage. They moved through underground tunnels, through ancient pathways hidden beneath the city's foundations. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the weight of the earth pressing down on them. It was the feeling that they were getting closer to the heart of the Cleaver Empire. And at the center of it all was something that Lena couldn't quite place. She could feel it, though, the weight of the enemy's presence, the silence. And then, like a pulse, it hit her. They weren't just fighting machines. They were fighting the idea of what humanity had become in the eyes of the Cleavers. The Cleavers didn't just want to control the Earth. They wanted to reshape it, to mold it into something perfect, something devoid of the flaws that made humanity human. Lena gritted her teeth. "We're not just here to stop them," she said, her voice low but filled with certainty. "We're here to remind them why they can't have this world." The heart of the Cleaver base was a cavernous, metallic structure, a chamber that could have housed an entire city. In the center of it all was the command center, an enormous, glowing structure surrounded by rows upon rows of drones, machines, and glowing screens that hummed with a cold, eerie energy. Lena's breath caught in her chest as she stepped into the center of the base, her eyes scanning the surroundings. They had made it. The heart of the Empire was within their reach, but it wouldn't be easy. It never was. They moved quickly, silently, taking down the first few Cleaver sentries without a sound. The key they had stolen from the underground vault had a secret, a way to hack into the Cleaver network. But they didn't have long. The longer they waited, the more reinforcements would arrive. Mikhail and Lena worked together, planting explosives in key locations, setting the stage for the final strike. They could already hear the distant hum of the Cleaver forces mobilizing. Their time was running out. "Ready?" Mikhail whispered, his face a mask of determination. Lena nodded. "Ready." It happened in an instant. The explosion shook the ground beneath them, sending shockwaves through the heart of the Cleaver Empire. The command center flared bright with fire and electricity as the base began to crumble, its once unbreakable walls shuddering under the force of their assault. The Cleavers were losing control. Their empire was falling apart. And the wolves? They weren't stopping. They had fought for so long, for so much, that the very idea of surrender was foreign to them. This was their world, their fight, and they would not let it slip away. As the Cleaver forces scrambled to regroup, the wolves pressed on. With the key in their hands and their resolve burning brighter than ever, they took down the last line of defense, detonating the final explosives that tore through the Cleaver command center. The world seemed to tremble with the sound of their victory. And then, in the middle of it all, there was silence. The Cleaver Empire had fallen, but it wasn't just the machines they had defeated. It was the idea that humanity was weak, that humanity was finished. Lena looked out over the burning remains of the Cleaver city, the stars above her reflecting a new dawn, a dawn they had fought for. "We did it," Mikhail said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded. "We did." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena allowed herself to believe in something she hadn't dared to believe for so long. That humanity's future wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of rebirth. They had won, and now they would rebuild.